Okay, let's get started. Good evening, everybody. This is the 7th RISE lecture. The purpose of this lecture, as you know, is to bring some of the greatest minds in economics, Nobel Laureates, here on campus and have them share their wisdom with us. And of course, let me mention that this is possible due to the generosity of Doyle Arnold, who was actually one of the main minds engineering this event. And so, again, we are delighted to have Doyle here, and thank you, Doyle, for making this possible. It's very special for me to be here today to introduce somebody I've known since 1992. I'm still remembering when I was on the job market as a budding economist trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And then I walk into Ed Prescott's office, and I was just sitting there extremely nervous. And then Ed started asking me questions that I had no idea what the answer was. But he really set up the stage for an amazing experience of, really one of the truly phenomenal minds who constantly presses you with the questions that you don't expect. Ed was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2004 together with Finn Kydland for his joint transformative work on macrodynamics. He has done pioneering work on the time inconsistency of government policy. He has worked on business cycle fluctuations. And I could go on and on and on. His seminal work on theory ahead of measurement. But I would say one of the things that really sets Ed apart, he is not just his desire of influencing the field of macroeconomics and the economics profession through his work, but through the work that his students are doing. I mean, I don't know anybody who's been more dedicated to producing the top minds and the top, the next generation of macroeconomists. Today, I was actually trying to go back and see whether I could get the full list of students that Ed has advised. And boy, once you start looking at that list, you go, unbelievable. I forgot that, Richard Rogerson. I forgot that, Victor Rios. And I forgot about Per Crusell, and on and on and on. And, literally, the field of macroeconomics is a different field because of the work that Ed has done, not just by himself, but through his students. And I know that he's still mentoring students at Arizona State. And today he's going to talk to us about some, in a typical Ed fashion, instead of saying, oh, let me talk about some work that I've done 34 years ago, he said, let me talk about some work that I'm doing. So please help me to welcome Ed Prescott.
It's a pleasure to be here. Why? I like successes. There's intensity, addressing economic questions and issues. It's not turning a crank type stuff. Rice will move, hopefully, to one of the a leading institution, the leading institute, first or second university in economics in the world. There's not many places that has this intensity. We have a little bit of it. I do as much as I can to foster it at ASU with some success. Antonio mentioned a lot of things, me asking questions. Now I know the answer to his question. His book's coming out in a month. He's right. He was right. The nature of governance matters for much of the differences in living standards across the world. This is about money. Back in the, I think it was the late 70s, I suggested that, well, money's not all that important. Maybe it's more like monetary policy, more like postal stamps. And we don't have a special board that gets all the attention doing on what we should do with postal economics. But now, more recently, oh, by the way, this intuition was confirmed. We only learned how to introduce that monetary factors when the household held money for transaction purposes and for purposes of smoothing consumption or making big expenditures for their trip around the world. But when that was brought in through the household sector, it turned out to be very, very tiny. Stokey and Lucas in about 81 set an explicit structure. And then you could incorporate that into what I call aggregate economics, a unified, hard, quantitative science. But then somewhat later, this recently, I gave the exercise to my graduate students to learn, so they could learn the tools of dynamic recursive economic analysis that we use. You know, there's a sort of what happens in the accounting period. They're the statistics we use. The micro people are the ones that gave us the aggregates, our national account system. And my great hero there is Larry Klein, with this explicit model that was all the accounting identities held. That's harder than you realize. And for every transaction, there's somebody on both sides. So let's get to the why I say that why I think that this exercise changed my views. I didn't expect that to happen when I assigned that exercise to the students. Oh, I should remind you of this fact. Microeconomics is a powerful and useful science. It's great for addressing micro questions. Macroeconomics is a powerful and useful science, but they're different sciences. You use macroeconomics theory for aggregate questions, and monetary policy is an aggregate question. You use micro for micro problems. I use both, depending upon the nature of the problem. Some people tried to use the micro to address aggregate problems. It failed. I worked in that tradition of you probably never even heard of ISLM, but that is the basis, Hicksian ISLM, for the macroeconometric models of Larry Klein, which was the key one. But people tried to use the micro reasoning to address aggregate questions. It failed, and failed spectacularly. Macroeconomics is just unified. Everything has to fit together. This revolution occurred about 1970, and it wasn't until we didn't have the tools to do quantitative analysis until near the end of about 1980. Over the last 10 or 15 years, incredible progress has been made. But those poor people in Washington, D.C. have been left in the, don't know what's going on. You have to be working in the tradition. But it's not hard, aggregate. My honors students at the undergraduate at ASU master this framework. I think it's probably simpler than the micro. And this is in a single course. And these honor students in the Barrett College are probably as smart as the honor students here One thing I tell the students, thou shalt not say supply or demand. Unless you're dealing with a micro problem, then you do. I mentioned general equilibrium reasoning is used with agents on both sides of every transaction. All accounting identities hold for the model economy being used to address the given question. It's amazing how these really simple structures are so useful in drawing inference about alternative policies. What will happen if these policies are adopted, policy rules or regimes. And this is, what will happen is an important input to the policy selection process. Economics doesn't say what you should do. It just says what will happen if. Interest rate targeting is popular. They tried to use some of the monetary aggregates, but they created substitutes, and it was just impossible. There's a nice interest rates. That's why the Fed shifted to that. Until recently, when the president of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank asked me what the Fed should do with regard to interest rates, my answer was that the economic theory does not provide an answer to the question. What you need to do is to develop better theory. Today, I will report on a recent advance of macro theory that can be and is used to answer such questions. By the way, some of the motivation, technology is advancing so much rapidly. There's been dramatic changes in the monetary payment system. In Sweden, people don't hardly ever use any currency anymore. U.S. may be moving in that direction as well when they're talking about this. Also, instant transactions, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Well, as I said, the household, putting the money in on the household side, it was done in a rigorous way. And you could do quantitative analysis, hardly mattered. So the price of a good is in units of value. We used to use a commodity value system. Value is in units of commodity, such as ounces of gold or silver. This was used in the U.S. before 1933. But then fiat came along. Value is in units of currency. You can take your $20 bill down to the Fed, and they'll give you two $10 bills. Promise to pay upon demand that many dollars. It wasn't where you could ask for gold. The advantage of the fiat system is obvious. You economize on the resources needed to acquire gold. It is what's used in the U.S. after 1933. Fiat value is a form of government debt. Prices are in units of fiat value. Name of the units of value is unimportant. General equilibrium models did not have money in them. They just had exchange for value, and you had a constraint on had to provide as much value as you received for during the accounting period. Most of these models, DeBrew made a big step forward in this. Paper's all of 6 pages long. And any student that masters that knows one heck of a lot of economics. And I notice we use a sequence of these value equilibrium. Why? Because the data is collected mostly from tax records. We have somebody monitoring. When you ask people questionnaires, they don't always give the right answer. Did you vote in the last election? I'm sure you did. But when you ask people that question, the amount who say they vote is significantly higher than the amount who did. And there's big census data is not that good. They don't even define what they mean by income, for example. And the income coming out of their censuses is much smaller than that coming out from the business records. The income is claims against output. The framework is very simple. There's a business sector. The household supplies the services of productive assets, of the capital they hold, tangible, intangible if they own directly or indirectly, et cetera. But the most important one is human capital. But you can't sell human capital. You just get the rental price. De Bruyne went to a little higher mathematics. When you go to mathematics and it gets more general and simpler, that's when mathematics is doing its job. It's great. As I said, there was a finite number of goods and only relative values of commodities were determined. In fiat value system, well, prices are in that. Are there some bankers here? By the way, I am a half-time central banker at the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank. They played a role in the commodity value system, but then they do fractional reserves to economize the amount of gold it needs. It's costly to dig gold out of the ground. By the way, it's costly to mine these bitcoins. They use a lot of electricity. The definition of a commercial bank is accept demand deposits, originate loans, and have fractional reserves. But it turns out the major role of banks is managing assets. They set up trusts where people pool their money and invest in projects. The actual payment transaction part is a small part of their total activity relative to the other. I think we should totally separate transaction services from asset management services. Have transaction banks and have other financial mutual firms. Sometimes some people would have to move across the hall and change the tag if they did this, but that's minor. But one thing that led me to this is I observed that businesses hold large amount of cash reserves. And business people, in general, are pretty smart. Businesses hold over $10 trillion in highly liquid assets that earn zero real return. They get about 4% on their investments after tax. And that's been the case since the national accounts started. They must be holding these for a reason. They must provide some services. I'm not going to model, I don't bother modeling all the details of that service or all the details of some physical capital machine that is rented to the business sector. Now, the business sector, I said, household supplies services of productive assets, and they get final product. In a stripped-down model, it's capital, it's consumption and investment. But one of these assets, is productive asset, will be real cash balances. The fact that they hold that, and these people are smart, must mean that something's not getting counted that should be counted. So they put that real cash balance as a factor of production, just like human capital services, tangible capital of various varieties, et cetera. Checkable deposits, only 0.08 annual GNP. Time and savings deposits, this is M2, nearly 60% of GNP. Yet business borrowing is 2.5 annual GNPs. One big financial institution, BlackRock, alone manages 0.25 GNPs. Fiat value is a form of government debt. Prices are in units of fiat value. Fiat value is a capital stock. It is rented to the business sector. Money is going to be short for fiat value and what follows, because we're used to using the word money. The model is pretty standard. You want the marginal product of money to be zero if money service input is large enough. So the question, how do you have a production function with this property where you get where the marginal product of some factor goes to zero in a nice, smooth, differentiable way? By the way, I've used sort of that Mackenzie, the late Lionel Mackenzie's language with the convex cones, and you don't have to, I like things simple. You don't have to worry about ownership because payments to the factors of production exhaust products, and there's no residual profits. Of course, constant returns to scale, concavity, you want the production function increasing weekly, and you want a differentiable. All you have to define, with constant returns to scale, to define a production function, all you need is one isoquant. We had an aggregate of capital and labor. That was one input. And we had real cash balance, others, an output for the this. The composite thing is labor, H, K capital, M money services, and then there's some parameters. These are pretty standard type relations until you get down to the satiation. At some point, oh, there's a good isoquant. I wanted to show you that. Should have come a little bit earlier. So Z is the vertical axis, the composite of capital and labor, and M real cash balances, and then output. And M over lambda is monetary, and it happens to be where you hit the satiation. That curve gets flat. Give you more money, businesses more money, they can't produce any more. They're satiated. Friedman said that was optimal, but turns out not to be the case in general. Okay, so this says what I just said, and there's no need to repeat it. What do? We always have measure one of household, Y, then we can deal per capita. Measure is, so you can talk about fraction of the people. Makes everybody small, rather than discrete and have to give everybody names and all kinds of complexities. I like things simple. Preference are ordered, discounted. Rho is how impatient this infinitely alive household is. I could have done it with the overlapping generation, but the results would have been the same. This is simpler. The logarithm of consumption plus alpha, how much disutility you have. You have 1 unit of time, normalization, and some fraction, HT, is allocated to the market and some to the household. Okay, now what people meant by policy. When I started looking at that, I once asked the students, what we have, let's put policy into Arrow de Brue type language, Mackenzie. And then I looked at what de Brue had done, he stayed far away from that. It turns out there's a lot of government policy variables. Inflation rate, even in this simple economy. Labor tax rate, government purchases of final product, transfers to households. If that's negative, it's a lump sum tax. The stock of money, the stock of government bonds issued, and the nominal interest rate on money and the nominal interest rate on government bonds. There's 2 forms of government debt. Regular government debt, which you get a market return on, and there's money. By the way, if I gave you the right, a monopoly on producing money, we estimate that, and things were enforced and what wasn't taken from you, you could make $10 trillion a year. That's a half a GMP. No, 5% of 20. I guess that's half a trillion. An equilibrium condition is that the rate of return on money, or the rental price, plus the interest that is paid on money, the Federal Reserve pays interest on reserves now, is equal to the interest rate on government bonds. With satiation, IM is 0. No, wrong. The rental price of money is zero, so IM equals IB. Budget constraints, all quantities are real, all prices are nominal. This just says the household consumes and invests in capital, money, and bonds. Households come in with stocks of these three assets and take in to the next accounting period new stocks of these three assets. Prime denotes next period. That's the standard shorthand notation. And what the sources of income. But the firm budget constraint, constant returns to scale. So payments to the factors, payments to labor, WH, plus payments to rental price of capital services, plus payments for rental services. There's no economic profit because of their constant returns to scale assumption. It makes life easier. You could put in some monopolistic competition and a lot of little bells and whistles. It doesn't change the story. Now the government budget identity. G is government, pure public good, national defense and things of that sort. Psi is the transfers. That's another. IM is the amount of interest paid by the government on money. And IB is the amount of interest rate paid on regular government debt. That is going to be equal to taxes on labor income plus the inflation tax in the square brackets. As I said earlier, dynastic and overlapping generation in our models are essentially equivalent. We have a natural rate of interest in the tradition of R.A. Fisher, about 4%. In balanced growth, stocks are, we're going to focus on steady state. Stocks are constant relative to output. So we can drop the beginning of prime and the beginning of next period stocks. On the left, our expenditures. On the right, our receipts. And it increases in debt. That's deficit financing. Well, money production is a government monopoly. Given how profitable it is, you can be pretty certain that the government's going to get that monopoly. But what's the meaning of equilibrium? When I looked at that letter, everybody was talking about indeterminacy of equilibrium, yet they would not give me a definition of what an equilibrium is. So when I look at that government cash flow constraint, a lot of variables come in. Wages, rental price of capital, money, rental price, and debt. Given prices and budget constraints, households, of course, choose what's best, their consumption plans and asset holding positions to maximize utility. Given prices, firms choose, well, just how much of the two inputs and three inputs, services, that maximize its value for every I, and that value has to be zero, of course, because it's constant returns to scale. If there was a profit opportunity, you could just scale up it and make everything. If you couldn't make a profit, you'd shut down. The government selection of all these, I call them policy variables, are such that its budget identity is satisfied for all T. We study only growth rate, only balanced growth. One of the hardest things to do in using dynamic general equilibrium is to make for the theoretical elements in the model, what are the empirical counterparts? Or for the empirical counterparts, what are the theoretical in this? And people don't know that much about national accounts anymore. Back in the early 50s, they did when these were developed. We have to have some targets. We want to have a world where the consumption investment share of product allocated to consumption estimate more or less constant. Fraction of time worked in the market, in the household sector, more or less constant. Asset stock to output ratio and factor income shares. Well, these are just, we had to pick a monetary satiation parameters that worked That's a free parameter. And there was policy, 5% share for public expenditure. State and local expenditures, we treat as part of consumption. This is done by, if you have twice as many villages, then you need twice as many of these resources. Public safety and roads, et cetera. Labor tax rate, 52%. That's about what it is. Marginal. Interest rate on money was a little over, this is for the period when we had about 2 or 3% inflation. Interest rate on government bonds a little bit higher, and the inflation rate, 2%. This little change necessitated a change in how national accounts are constructed. Product goes from 1 to 1.08. Final product is consumption, the things in black. Household investment in K, government public consumption, and investment 5%. But money production, it costs us to produce this stuff. This is why you can make a big profit, is a part of output. This is a great monopoly to have. You can sell a lot of it, and it costs in the model 0 to produce. Of course, income has to equal product. That's an accounting identity. To get it to do that, there's money rental income and central bank profits. So receipts, 0.44 GDP. Tax revenues, 33, a third. Money issues, 0.08. Debt issues, 0.03. On expenditures, money interest payments. Is that the thing? Well, we did some explorations. As I said, there's a bunch of variables. We wanted to get as far away from fiscal policy as possible and focus only on monetary. Therefore, we kept a lot of things fixed. The size of relative to output, Y. The amount of transfers made. The amount of public expenditures. But then there's these other things. Inflation rate, pi, tax rate on labor, tau. Some of the policy variables are endogenous. A steady state equilibrium either exists and is unique or doesn't exist. Here's a monetary policy with endogenous tax rates. As I said, we kept a couple some things fixed. The size of government debt relative to GNP, only a half. An inflation rate at 2. The variables across regimes that vary. On the horizontal axis is the money interest rate target. There's an inflation tax and there's a corresponding one endogenous variable, it's the tax rate. You could put any endogenous variable on the vertical axis. The welfare is what we care about. This is in lifetime consumption equivalents. As we see, it peaks out. At a point, it gets to be a lousy tax. In a regime with fixed inflation rate target, fiscal policy must respond to change in interest rate policy. Hump-shaped welfare rises for 2 reasons. Higher interest rate means more money, more output, if the marginal product's positive. Higher interest rate means higher labor tax, less output. Welfare highest when interest rate on money is 6% in our model economy. That matches reality on a number of important dimensions. Now you can, and by the way, 2% is magic in this central bank game for targets for the interest rate and inflation rate. I'm not sure exactly why. And this is what the money stock regime. You get too much money, that you get satiated economies. And then as you can see, in this example, welfare goes up until you hit the, I guess, 1.75. The money stock relative to annual GNP. Fiat value currency system and negative nominal interest rates are not feasible if you have currency. People just hold currencies. The Indians held a lot of currency, but then they got tricked. And they could only get 70% back on the dollar, on the rupee. Or is it rupee? But if you don't have the currency, this has a zero bounds in it, and you can have Friedman satiation with positive inflation. Friedman satiation deflate at the rate of the real interest rate. This has the inflation rate targeting. And of course, for different inflation, you have different tax rates. But when you look at welfare in terms of lifetime consumption equivalents, that seems to be, it's hump-shaped. Welfare highest when inflation is 2.5%. Labor tax rate is 49.5%, lower than the baseline. Having some inflation has turned out to be an effective method of financing government consumption. Well, some others have done a lot on this. But I must say, I smiled a bit when I went up to the president of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank and say, now you asked me what the interest rate should be, target should be, and I said I think it was 2.5% or 4%. Now we have an answer, or some answer at least. A lot more work should be done in this area. One thing, you get rid of all those bank runs. By the way, it's very costly regulation. The U.S. deposit insurance, it costs about 0.5% per year of deposits at banks. It's not free. Those examiners are expensive. They get paid better than the bankers there. We put money into the aggregate. The success was consistent with both of the traditional demand for money and with zero nominal interest rates for extended periods. Much more research is needed. The near monies, the shadow banking, a currency-less system would have to have a lot of monitoring, and you worry about privacy. The Europeans are very worried about that. But monetary policy and fiscal policies are not independent. You can't give credit to the central bank for the U.S. economy doing well now. Why is the U.S. economy doing so well now? The AI revolution. It's the engineers and scientists, including economic scientists. And there's huge investments and unmeasured investment that times are even better than these statistics indicate. Well, that completes. So now I can say to Cash Carey, we can give answers to your questions, and that makes me feel good, because I don't like to be thwarted by problems. I like to, and the whole system is unified. That's it.
Questions, you can just step up to the podium, either one of those microphones, and Prescott is going to be happy to answer your questions.
So I'll ask you a variant of the question asked you by your president of the Minneapolis Fed. The question is, given this framework, was Ben Bernanke, was he beyond the point of satiation, if I understand your use of the term, in his quantitative easing? Or was that an appropriate policy for any time and for as long as he did it? Or was he pushing on a string with that, if you will? Because that's my interpretation of being satiated.
Yeah. I'm not a fan of Bernanke's policies. He and Paulson, I believe, said the world's coming to an end. If Greenspan had been in there at that time, who was a masterful politician, you would never hear about anything. When some of the money market funds couldn't pay didn't have enough new money coming in to pay what they had promised, they provided the liquidity, and it wasn't that hard to do. And you don't say troubled assets, the world is coming to the end. You just say central, because when you have crises, inevitably there's reforms. Some reforms are good, and the economy does great. That happened in the crises in Scandinavia. Sometimes there's not. Japan, for example. These were both about 1992 events. So if Bernanke he was talking about fire sales back in the, but should have just let, the Polish, why can they do much better? They let their couple of their big banks fail, and they got recapitalized, and lo and behold, they didn't have any recession. They in that period, they grew. They and Australia were the two OECD countries, but Australia had a lot of natural resources, which is different than Poland. In most countries, in the whole Far East, the financial crises don't seem to have much real consequences. We had the most chaotic financial system in the 19th century that you could think of. Tom Sargent is the person to read on that. That was a period where the U.S. caught up to the U.K. in living standards in, say, post-Civil War, and then moved from about 30% below to 30% higher over that 40-year period or 50-year period. Monetary authorities should not say that we can stabilize, we can create, it's the physical authorities that are responsible for good policies. They impose some constraints on money. It should be, we want a stable, we want price stability, we like a sound payment and credit system to facilitate in the various regional banks. And actually the Fed did a pretty good job in those dimensions. The one big failure was AIG. But that was an insurance company. Insurance companies are regulated by states, and they're a big sector. Value added over 5% of GNP. And it was just badly regulated by the state of New York. And they gambled and lost, or the stockholders did.
I have another question. You mentioned Bitcoins earlier and the cryptocurrencies. And do you think that the welfare will benefit in the long run from these cryptocurrencies, given that?
Well, it's expensive to produce. You use a lot of electricity. I wish I had a good answer to your question. It's a good question. But I don't think the government would tolerate this major source of revenue that they currently have. If they wanted to go to a big, and I think it's probably a better system with the fiat money that the government, whether or not you permit currency or not is another matter, or everybody effectively have their accounts, and if you give me a glass of beer, I give you 25 cents. That's what it used to be. But now it's $2.
Dr. Prescott, so if you look at the ongoing trade wars between the United States and China, I was wondering, like among other policies such as trade sanctions, increasing tariffs, what do you think the short-term and long-term influence this, like all these measures will, like how will they influence both countries?
China's developed the fintech field. They catapulted to leadership, and people are copying them. I'm associated with those people as a foreign advisor to their fintech lab in Shenzhen and the global one in new one in Chengdu. And it was all done by small and mid-sized enterprises. And yet there's one key person, Arthur Cow, who's coordinate all these activities of these small and business, medium-sized enterprise. They could not be the expert in everything. You may suppose there's 4 different expertise you need. And you don't need it at every instant either. So you have expertise in one, and when somebody needs that, there's some other fintech company, there's a gain of a trade. And this is, and he organized so these people interact so they could coordinate so that when you could sell the extra, your fintech services to other banks, and you could get there were 4 types, other 3. And he sort of lined these people up in this office. And it was a matching phenomena. He saw the need to coordinate. And he happened to be, well, I don't know how he does it, but he can operate. But in China, I don't think that, they don't have a lot of electricity there. There's domestic uses of that. So I don't think they want to waste it all on producing bitcoins.
Is the United States realizing their goals in this trade war, like domestically?
Well, the U.S. has been, if you have a brokerage account, you need it's the federal funds reserves, it's short-term nominal debt that's used for the clearing, et cetera. And then then they're talking about making these transactions continuous time, 7 days a week. And I think that'd be a great improvement. These weekends when you see your money flowing about, and things can be finalized. There's going to be a lot of technology change and improvements in the payment system. And I suspect the government will want us to have this monopoly. It's because it's so profitable. Mao Tse-tung got rid of the old money and said, well, issue new. And when you issue it, you get a lot of goods and services for that. You get worried about that if you're, say, a Russian, so you hold US dollars. Even worse if you're in Venezuela. I hope I didn't, whose governance has failed spectacularly.
Okay, let's thank Professor.
Thank you for this opportunity.